Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph. We'll begin Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. We learned previously that Rabbi Yehuda, he says that there was no pushka, there was no collection box, there was no shayfer for the kinei chayva, for money that had to be used to purchase the birds of a korban chayva. For instance, zav, yoledes, tamei mikdash v'kadoshav. That in such a case there was a pair of birds that had to be brought. One was for a chatas, one was for an idol. Now, even though for kinei nedova there was a shayfer, but not for kinei chayva, because in a case where the owner died, then there would be mixed in with this collection box, there would be mixed in money that was money of a chatas. Now, the halacha l'maish misinai is that if there is a chatas shemesa ba'aleha, the animal would have to go to Misa. If it's a money, you'd have to throw it to Yom Melech, and that would aser all the money. So in such a case, therefore, there was the concern, and that all the money would become aser. Therefore, they did not have the collection box for the kinei chayva. The Gemara asks a question: well, why not just take the 4 zuzim and throw 4 zuzim, take 4 zuzim from the box, throw it into the Yom Melech, and say breira that this money was the one that was set aside for the owner that died, for the owner of the chatas that died, and therefore all the other money would be muter. Why don't we rely on the principle of breira, that it should clarify it retroactively that the money that was thrown into the Yom Melech, that that was the money of the owner that died? Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda, Lesley Breira, but Rabbi Yehuda does not hold of Breira. Now the Gemara is going to try to prove, to establish how we know that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold of the principle of Breira. Min Nolan, in fact, the Gemara Min Nolan, how do we know that? Ile Memahad is not. Perhaps you'll say it's from the following. So the Gemara says it's not, which implies a Mishnah, but in fact what is being quoted exactly over here is a Baraisa. It says, it says, if someone purchased wine from the kusim, Erev Shabbos im Chashecha, this is in the brackets, it says Erev Shabbos im Chashecha, he purchased the money from the kusim. There's actually 2 Lashonos in Rashi. Is it Erev Shabbos im Chashecha, meaning it's right before Shabbos, so he didn't have time to take the Trumas and Meisers from it, and on Shabbos you can't. So he has now this wine which he has purchased from the kusim, which we assume that they did not take the Trumas and Meisers. Another approach is Slav Dakva on Erev Shabbos im Chashecha, but he purchased the wine from the kusim, and he doesn't have kelim which are tohar, in which to currently be marfish to separate the wine and put it into these other kelim. So in any event, we're talking about a case where he bought the wine from the kusim, and the kusim are deemed not to have taken b'mafresh trumas and maasros. He cannot actually physically, at this point in time, separate the trumas and maasros. Now, what is the eitzah so that he should be able to have this wine available for him, either for Shabbos or otherwise? What's the eitzah that he should have the wine available for him? Now, we're saying that the kusim were not mafresh trumas and maasros, so we have to be going over here, therefore, on the premise that it's their wine, meaning it's the wine that was grown in their region, and there is a chiyuv of trumas and maasros, which means that we consider the kusim to be gerei emes, and we consider them to be genuine gerim and yidden, and therefore there would be a chiyuv. Their wine would have a chiyuv of trumas and maasros. Then they would be mechuyev in the trumas and maasros to have to take from their wine. Now we know we have a principle that the kusim, in anything that their shaymer, that whatever's written in the Torah Beferish, they keep it more than even the Yidden, more than Yisrael. So why do we assume over here that the kusim were not mafresh the trumas and maasros? So there is several reasons given that we assume that they don't. The first point is that they are not zohir on lifnei iver. So even if they would be mafresh trumas and maasros for themselves, for their own consumption, but they are not Zohar and Lifnei Iver Litei Michshol. They interpret it literally. Don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. They don't interpret it to mean that don't cause a person to do an Aveira. And therefore, it doesn't bother them to sell it to a Yisrael without having been mafresh trumas and maasers. What about the monetary aspect of that? Well, aren't they stealing from the Kayan? Aren't they stealing from the Levium? Isn't there a monetary aspect of it that's a problem? So regarding that, Taisus and Gittin has several approaches. He says that number one, they don't consider it to be Gezel because it's a moment shein lo tovim. There's no specific Kayan, no specific Levi that can make a demand and say, give this to me. There's no one in particular that it has to be given to. It has to be given to Kohanim in general, Leviim in general, but there's no one that has a personal monetary claim. So they don't consider this to be Gezel. That's number one. Number two is that they say that another approach Taisus gives is that they say the chiyuv to give to the kohen is only after the hafrosha. There's no chiyuv prior to the hafrosha, and they don't have to be mafresh because they don't have it for their own consumption. So therefore, they don't consider this to be gezel because there's no chiyuv to give it at this point. Taisus also mentions is that they darshan that the chiyuv to be mafresh is if it's only for your consumption, but if you're selling it, there's no chiyuv to be mafresh. I'll go upon him. He has this wine from the kusim. He has this wine. He can't physically separate the truma of the meiser. What does he do to enable him to be able to consume the wine? So what he does is he says as follows. He stands and says, Shnei lugim shani osid lahafresh harein truma. So he says that why will be mafresh later, when it's after Shabbos, when he has kalim which are tahirim, he's going to be mafresh. He says the 2 lugim, so he has 100 lugim in this barrel. He says 2 lugim that I will be mafresh. That is retroactively, that is the truma, and the truma on that should be chal now. Meaning he can't separate it at the moment, but he has this barrel of 100 lugim. He says, well, for example, tomorrow, those 2 lugim that I'm going to be mafresh tomorrow, retroactively, they should be considered to be the truma. That was the truma, and therefore, the balance of it, the rest of the wine, has no truma. It's considered to be retroactively separated from now. So this is the 2 lugim because that's the midah beinanis of 2%. Now midoraisa it's chita chas b'teres is agreed. You only need a minimal amount. But midorabanan there's an ein yofa, an ein ra, an ein beinanis. So it's an example of 2 lugim. Then he says asara the 10 lugim that I will eventually be mafresh ma'aser rishon, that retroactively will be deemed to be ma'aser rishon. The ma'aser rishon is 10%. So one approach in Taisus, he says that it's actually not precise because once he's taken off 2 lugim, there's only 98 lugim left, so it's really only 9.8. It's only 9.8. But it's rounded off, it says 10. Another approach in Taisus says no, that he would have to give the full 10% because midoraisa it's chita achas b'teres is it's a minimal amount. When the Rabbanan instituted that there should be more than that, but they didn't institute that it should be at the expense of the Levi. So the amount that the Levi would be entitled to, which is 10% of only a minimal amount of the reduction of the truma min ha'torah, so it's 10%. They did not want to reduce that portion from the Levi. They did not want to take that away from the Levi. So therefore, it remains at 10% of the whole. Theoretically, 10% minus a minimal amount, but practically speaking, 10%. Therefore, 10 lugim are ma'aser rishon. Tisher ma'aser sheni. Then from the balance of that, you have to take ma'aser sheni. So after taking truma, you take the truma, take 10% of ma'aser rishon. What's remaining after that is 10% is ma'aser sheni. So therefore, it's either they have 10% of that, which means 9. meaning once you've taken off the Truma Gedola and you've taken off the lugin, the 10 lugim for Meiser Rishon, you have 90 lugim remaining, or slightly less than that, and you take 10% of the balance, which is a 9 lugim, or slightly less than that, and you take that. That's Meiser Sheni. Now, Meiser Sheni is to be taken up and consumed in Yerushalayim. Now, over here, he has an option of not relying on Breira, because he could already now transfer it. He could be mechalel it and have the wine to be chulin. So umechal, he redeems that. He says wherever that is, wherever that portion of it, the Meiser Sheni is in this barrel of wine, I am transferring the kedusha to this money. So he transfers the kedusha onto the coins. The coins will now have the kedusha of Meiser. They have to be taken up to Yerushalayim and used for the purchase of food in Yerushalayim. But the wine, therefore, will become chulin. So Divrei Reb Meir, these are the words of V'shoysamiyad, rather, and he is able to drink it immediately. He's able to drink the wine immediately because he's made the hafrasha of the Trumas and Meisers, and he did the chilul for the Meiser Sheni, and therefore he can drink it shoysa miyad, Divrei Reb Meir. Those are the words of Reb Meir. So Reb Meir is relying on Breira. Now it should be pointed out that there is a discussion, a machlokes, whether this is Breira works for din deraisa or derabanan. We have said till now that the kusim have an obligation with deraisa, and therefore the Breira would help midaraisa, but there's another approach, is that they're considered geri arayas. They don't have any chiyuv. They have a chiyuv midrabanan. The whole chiyuv of it was midrabanan, to take trumas hamaisas from what is purchased from the kusi, because the kusim are considered goyim, and the chiyuv is a chiyuv derabanan, not a deraisa. But in any event, Reb Meir holds of Breira, whether it's Minater midrabanan is a machlokes, but he holds of Breira. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, Eisrim, but they say it's also. They say you cannot rely on this alma in Breira. So it seems to be that this is our proof that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold of Breira. Where it says no, mimai. What's your right from here that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold a Breira? Dilma shani hasam kidiktani taima. Maybe the reason is, like it says at the end of the brisa, Amru Reb Meir, they said to Reb Meir, Iata Maida Shemi Bakanoid, Venimsa Shaisu Tvalam Lemafreya. They said to him, how can you rely on Breira over here? Breira would only take effect if ultimately there was hafrasha. So let's say after Shabbos at some time they were mafreshed, there was a keli that was tore, they separated it. Then you could say, Hoover Darul Mafreya, while retroactively it was deemed all along this was the Trumas and Meiser. This wine was the Trumas and Meiser. So Hoover Darul Mafreya retroactively, that yes, what was separated tomorrow on Sunday, that was the Trumas and Meisers that was always determined to be the Trumas and Meisers, and what the person drank was chulin. But if there is no ultimate hafrosha, then we can't say that Hoover Darul Mafreya, that what was separated was the Trumas and Meisers. If there was never a separation, then there was nothing that was therefore deemed to be the Trumas and Meiser. Now perhaps the barrel will burst and break. The wine will spill out. Maybe there won't be a hafrosha, and therefore we can't rely on that. And therefore, perhaps it's not because they don't hold a breira, perhaps it's because they're chayshesh, that it's a chashash that this might happen, and therefore they say don't rely on the breira because there may never be an ultimate separation of hafrosha. And V'omer Lahem, Rameir said to them, I'm not worried about it. When it splits, we're worried about it. I mean, you don't have to be chayshish for this possibility, for this eventuality. But upon you have no raya from here, therefore, that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold a breira. Maybe he does hold a breira, but he is chayshish, he's chayshish for Shemi Bakan Noid, that the barrel might split open.